Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. It is time for another news roundup edition of the podcast, and that means I am joined once again by Eamon McCarthy-Earls. Hey, Eamon, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Jason.
And let's get things started. We have quite a few, I should say, it's been a little while since we've done one of these. We're going to play a little bit of catch up, not going back too far, but maybe a tiny bit further than we typically go in a news roundup episode. We'll look at some of the coverage we've done and also highlight a few of the features that we've put out, both things that you and I have written or our team has written and things that come from the community as well. So let's start off with the first one. Microsoft prepares for the launch of Cloud for Financial Services. This was really an announcement of the goals that are coming up for launching it on November 1st. That's going to be preceded by a launch event a few days earlier. And really, this is just the next step in Microsoft's industry cloud strategy by sort of firming up the financial services vertical. They had a couple highlights in it that's going to be really focused on retail banking. There will be features rolled in that I assume come from sort of existing capabilities, fraud and purchase protection, which sounds very familiar to what the Dynamics 365 offering is there. I don't know exactly if it's exactly the same or just using some of the same technology. Also security and compliance capabilities that are very relevant to the financial services industry as well. And of course, they're pulling in a lot of partners, both for IP, for data model that was developed with or even by partners to help their clients in the financial services area. And I think we'll be hearing more as we get closer to this. I talked to some partners. I know that there are some NDAs still in place about what's exactly in the launch, but I do hope to hear more once we get closer to it at the end of October.
One of the other things that's been really interesting is some of the recent some information out about Dynamics 365 field service that you reported on, coming close to $200 million in annual revenue, according to an analyst report.
Yeah, I have to say over the last couple of years, the field service management Magic Quadrant from Gartner has been an interesting one in that it tends to dig into some actual sort of performance data from the vendors. And this time around, last time I covered this, I guess it was a year ago, it wasn't specific revenue estimates. It was other data. But this time they put a revenue estimate on 2020 revenue for every vendor that was in that field service management evaluation. Microsoft was already marked as a leader by Gartner. They were once again, and this time around, Gartner estimated that their revenue was $190 million in 2020, just for D365 field service. That number puts them kind of right in the middle, not the highest, not the lowest of what Gartner considers to be the leaders in that space. And that, that they're growing, both their, I think last year it was that they were growing their user counts, not that they were growing revenue. That was the estimate. And I think it just speaks to, what they see as the strength of the capabilities themselves. I think Microsoft only got dinged on things like the complexity and the expertise needed to deploy it, and that maybe there are not enough service providers out there. I believe maybe licensing or pricing was another one where the maybe price was not that competitive. But I think if they're growing user count and their prices are high, they should be growing revenue pretty fast. I actually thought that those two claims didn't perfectly line up if they're having great growth and they're charging a lot. You know what I mean? Just another interesting point, if Dynamics is a $3 billion business, perhaps, maybe more, maybe less, $190 million is not nothing. It's a measurable percentage, but it still just shows you what one corner of the D365 suite is really doing to contribute.
Well, these days I wear many hats with MS Dynamics World and MS Cloud News, and for sort of my day to day, I tend to wear the hat of Azure coverage a little bit more often. So I've been delving into a lot of interesting changes going on with Azure services, and some of the changes around cloud for healthcare are really interesting as Microsoft continues to make a play for healthcare markets worldwide, but particularly in the US, which are very, very, very profitable. So there's obviously been a big set of shifts since October of last year when Cloud for Healthcare was first introduced, ranging from pre-built tools to things like industry accelerators, FHIR support, HealthBot services for teams, security enhancements, data insights, and so forth. One of the big changes, of course, that's been very interesting was the acquisition back in April of Nuance, which provides the sort of DragonSpeak software that many people in healthcare and law are familiar with, which is a pretty big play for Microsoft in that space. And so we delved into some of these aspects of sort of healthcare industry changes around Microsoft Azure services in a recent article. And I would definitely encourage our readers to check that out for more in-depth sort of information on all of this. Of course, that leads me to the Truveta story, which is an interesting one. Jason, what was your take on sort of the data platform investment and partnership announcement that came out around Cloud for Healthcare with Truveta?
Yeah, well, it was primarily, from what I can tell, another way to enhance the Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare. It was just one more step that Microsoft was taking to get more data analysis capabilities as part of that. It's an interesting, it's an interesting move. I hadn't been familiar with the Truveta initiative before that. It's sort of like a company co-owned by 15 provider organizations in the US primarily. That's how it's been founded. They now have goals to go worldwide. And what they do is they take data from across their sort of patient data from across all their practices, which they say is at least 15% of the US healthcare system's patient care, and anonymize it, take the patient specific data out of it, and then use it for research, essentially, for doing analysis of treatments, for, other kinds of medical research, or as they say, quote unquote, ethical medical research, and not for advertising, not for marketing, new drugs or anything like that, theoretically. It's one of those things that there's, like, as you said, there's no denying the power of the healthcare industry, especially in the US and around the world. So I personally, I'm always very suspicious of what these for-profit medical groups are doing with their data. They say it's going to be really for research purposes. I mean, this is a for-profit company. They're going to basically sell access to this anonymized clinical data for all these different uses. And I think a lot of the really interesting stuff, if you want to get back to that in terms of the news, was the sort of the access to this data and how Microsoft's going to try to support that with Azure services. And I assume there's a bunch of different challenges there, everything from sort of the collection and aggregation of this data to the data management and, some of the big data challenges, and then the reporting and the data science of it as well. So we'll have to see sort of what comes out of this, and we'll have to see how internationally, other providers, whether it's state-run or private in various countries, choose to get involved, whether they're just doing research or whether they're actually contributing more data as well. So a really, really interesting sort of element, a very sort of consequential addition to the Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare if they're going to make a service out of this to some degree, or at least make Truveta a partner. So yeah, I think it's very interesting and, kind of slots right into that larger healthcare conversation that, certainly is ongoing in the US, but sort of from an IT standpoint is, I guess, worldwide or global.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how that all evolves going forward. Another bit of news that I know you reported on was the Zuora subscription management service for Azure, which has been integrated with D365 and Power BI. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, Jason? I didn't really follow the news that closely when it first broke.
I didn't view it as a huge piece of news, but it got a lot of reads on our site, which certainly caught my attention. And I thought it was, definitely worthwhile to cover because it's a broad-ranging partnership between Zuora and Microsoft. They'll be running on Azure and, like you said, integrating with Dynamics 365 and Power BI more natively. Their subscription management vendor, their applications can be hosted on Azure. It's revenue management. It integrates now with Dynamics 365 Finance. And one other thing that caught my eye on it was the Chief Product and Engineering Officer at Zuora, who is someone named Sri Srinivasan. If you've been in the Microsoft ERP space for a while, you will definitely recognize that name. He was one of the chief technical leaders of the Dynamics ERP space until 2018 when he left the company, but he was really one of the people really in the spotlight there. He went on to Cisco for a few years and he joined Zuora, I guess, earlier this year. Subscription management is one of those very kind of promising, lucrative, growing spaces that tacks on very nicely to ERPs as there's compliance issues. There's, obviously subscription revenue as a model or as a way of interacting with your customers is only growing. And ERPs don't always have a great answer for that. So these subscription management services, and there's others that are already kind of well established in the dynamic space, but they have a really, compelling story to tell. And so the other thing I would just add is Zuora, I thought it was interesting just to read when they announced this Microsoft partnership, they also announced unrelated, I think, other solutions that they have planned, unified monetization. And so just to kind of give a flavor of what that might mean, generally, the whole vision that they talk about is monetize anything as a service. So So it can be commerce, it can be subscriptions, obviously, it can be other types of business arrangements, structuring them and monetizing them as a service. I think, please don't ask me to give you the full vision of that, because I can't say I totally get it, but that's sort of how broadly Zuora seems to be looking at this space, and different vendors obviously take different approaches. But yeah, so that definitely got our readers' attention too, and a new entrant into that capability in the Microsoft channel.
So I want to know about the acquisition of ISV 365 Cannabis. This is or I guess it's it was
365 Cannabis.
365 Cannabis, yes. And that was an Akerna acquisition for about $17 million. That happened pretty recently.
Yeah,
Tell me more about that.
It was notable, firstly, because they were open about what the acquisition price was. Akerna is a publicly traded, I believe, US-based company. They have been fairly acquisitive, and they have bought all sorts of different properties in recent times. I forget the whole overall time span, but they bought 365 Cannabis, which is a Dynamics 365 Business Central-based solution for the cannabis industry. And by buying that, they are sort of rounding out their portfolio of different solutions that they own. That now, this was the first one, I believe, that touches Microsoft's sort of D365 space. They had others that touched SAP, Sage, NetSuite, I believe. So in that sense, it's a little bit of sort of just a broadening sort of their reach. But also, I think it must add some new capabilities. Obviously, it's Business Central based, plus features and capabilities that are unique to the cannabis industry in the US, and it's US and Canada primarily, but I think they have plans to expand it as well. But they shared some details. 365 Cannabis has over 85 clients. It generated $8.2 million in annual revenue, and 5.2 million of that is SaaS revenue. So those are really interesting sort of data points that you don't hear from ISVs all that much. And it kind of gives you an idea of how they reached their $17 million, acquisition price. 70% margins on their SaaS revenue too, which is, I think if for anyone else doing SaaS, that's a valuable kind of data point to hear how this particular company is doing. I mean, they kind of emerged really purely out of the Microsoft channel. As I understand it, 365 Cannabis started out of an American division of a UK-based Microsoft partner organization that started, I think, broad-based on Nav and Business Central, and then decided to really go into pure industry on cannabis. And I think that's where they've really focused. They didn't become sort of a US partner like regular VAR or anything. They really became an ISV, and this is their exit, I guess, is joining Akerna. So that's kind of an interesting story of an ISV acquisition here in North America.
Well, another area that I've been covering with MS Cloud News lately is some of the developments with machine learning capabilities, particularly Azure Machine Learning. And it's very, very interesting perspectives. I can't do justice to them in brief, so I certainly encourage our readers to check out the full article, which is much more expansive in sort of its treatment of the subject. But there's been some interesting developments, both in terms of use cases, lots of different opportunities to drive value for organizations with machine learning, but still some challenges. The sort of ML ops framework has kind of emerged as a way to hopefully bring these things all under one roof and sort of better plan and implement machine learning projects. But there continue to be challenges with a lack of coordination between sort of machine learning experts and data scientists, as well as issues with some ML models actually sort of shifting and kind of ending up out of sync over time, depending on what data they're relying on, where it's always this constant sort of matter of training, but there's ways that these models can kind of get off track pretty easily if you're not careful. And I also did some interesting reporting on Dynamics 365 Media and Entertainment Accelerator additions, particularly with the integration with Teams and the addition of content workflow support, which is a pretty interesting shift. And it'll be interesting to see how Microsoft continues to position that going forward, as it also sort of focuses on hybrid event broadcasting, remote collaboration, archiving, asset management, data model entities, and all of these different fields that are sort of emerging, especially in this hybrid work environment that we see right now.
In an industry, I guess, where content is so critical, it is interesting to see how this industry accelerator is being positioned and how some of these content workflows are being built. I mean, I have to say, it seems like the right tools are there to make this possible. I don't really know of too many use cases. I can think of a couple that are actually older in the Microsoft space with like production companies and that sort of thing. But it looks like the goal or the vision of it is really go all the way from sort of back office to front office in the entertainment space with data for for content and managing live events and having fan-facing presence as well as sort of content production. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve.
Now, one of the big changes recently, or I guess one of the big bits of information that's come to light recently, has been a series of different Microsoft sort of security vulnerabilities. And you did a report on one involving PowerApps Portals that was kind of embarrassing, unfortunately, with millions of private records revealed according to a security firm.
Yeah, this one was a little bit in the past at this point. The original revelation on it came from, the cybersecurity firm. And it was something that I think not everyone, Portals experts immediately understood, because it was something that wasn't a bug. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't it wasn't a problem, a technical problem on Microsoft's part that was being talked about that got a lot of headlines, because anytime you talk about millions of private records, mainstream media picks up on it. It ends up on, the front page of major news publications. But if you sort of dive into it and read the original security company's report, which I thought they did a very good job on, by the way, and I think no one's really had any issue with what they wrote or revealed, it raised sort of an interesting conundrum or question. I mean, there was clearly, the facts as they laid them out were that there was exposed data lying out there on the internet. And it's something that we've heard of before, containers, public cloud containers, holding lots of files that were publicly available, that kind of thing. It was that type of situation where if you figured out if you read the documentation of PowerApps Portals, you could understand how to get at a lot of this data. And the reason it was exposed was essentially a configuration error or a misconfiguration by the administrators of these portals. Now, it was a misconfiguration, but then you get into sort of a philosophical debate. They could easily fix the exposure, get rid of the exposure, if they properly configured some of these access points. But should they have had to? I mean, at what point, to me, it's sort of like, at what point does a configuration, a tricky configuration, really become the same as a bug? I mean, how many large-scale portals deployments from very well-known companies or organizations have to be compromised before it's not their fault anymore, before it's the software vendor's fault, before it's Microsoft's fault, right? So that's really, and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I tend to vote, not that it matters, but I would vote on the side of, there were so many major large scale portals for, publicly facing portals for big companies, for not-for-profit, for government agencies, state, local, that it was at the scale that, this was probably Microsoft's fault. They should have they should have identified this vulnerability, the potential for there to be a problem here, and taken corrective action before a security firm figured it out, right? Did they technically do anything wrong? No, I don't think they technically did anything wrong. Philosophically, I think they messed up, though. And I have to just call out that I think the security firm, again, that reported on it appears to have done really an impeccable job holding up to their own sort of ethical and legal guidelines for themselves. I think they got a little bit of a raw deal from one of the portal owners that they worked with to actually help solve the problem. I think it was the state of Indiana, who really just tried to misrepresent what the security firm was doing and acted as if they were, looking for a payout or trying to threaten them with security breach or something if they didn't hire them, which it doesn't appear to be at all the case. And they had a paper trail to prove it. I think some of these victims, if you will, or the organizations or agencies that were impacted tried to just pass at least in Indiana, they tried to pass the buck and blame the people who actually discovered the issue and helped them fix it, which was unfortunate too. But I think, as a result, we've had actually 2 webcasts ourselves that have talked about this, and I'll try to link to those in the show notes, by our resident Portals community call host, Nick Hayduk of Engineered Code. He talked about it on his monthly calls and gave his perspective. And then if you look back into sort of the PowerApps Portals blogging community, there were, I would say, 4, 6, 8 different blog posts from very knowledgeable people with good technical knowledge of portals, who also wrote about this and gave their perspective on how to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. Microsoft also did take action after the fact to update sort of the default configuration so it doesn't happen anymore. So that's that issue. It's a bit in the rearview mirror now. I don't know that anyone took too much heat for it in the long term, because it really wasn't a bug. It wasn't a mistake. So and I think it just helps people hopefully remember that configuration and security are super important with public-facing cloud services.
Well, at this point, I want to encourage our listeners to check out some great features we've had recently. This is obviously not an exhaustive list because we've had quite a few people write for us, but just a few I wanted to call out. One being some great perspective from Andy Nelson of Insight, all about the intelligent edge and the role of IoT Edge, Azure Stack Edge, and Azure Percept, and how all those can fit together for organizations. So some really interesting perspective there. Elif Item, or Etam, I always forget how to pronounce her last name. She had some really interesting thoughts on Dynamics 365 training, focused particularly on e-commerce, and in a D365 vein as well. Heidi Newhauser discussed 2021 Release Wave 2 for D365 and some of the kind of key perspectives from that.
Yeah, I would second all of those, and there's probably more worth mentioning, but those are definitely three of the good ones. Alif's Training Insights series is wrapping up. That was the e-commerce one you mentioned. That was article and video 11 out of 12, and so that's been a really outstanding series. Yeah, and so there was a 12th one. I apologize. Kind of focused on the IT users or IT role as it relates to a Dynamics 365 deployment. So check that one out as well. That was the wrap up, I believe, to the year-long, one per month Training Insights article and video series. Really appreciate her really seeing that through on a nice long series that took on all sorts of different roles, from finance and administrators to IT and, like you said, e-commerce, warehouse, I believe. So it's really pretty comprehensive, and she did a great job with that.
And lest we forget, of course, among features, I also just want to call out one of the features that you wrote about Power Platform 2021 Release Wave 2 and some of the expert kind of insights you were able to pull up in that area, as well as some of the insights you have related to Dataverse access and all of that.
Yeah, the release waves are great for just getting a sense of what other people think is important, especially really active bloggers and Microsoft MVPs and so forth. So, we're actually just entering into release wave 2 here. The date given for that is October 2021. So I assume that features are already going to start rolling out, in the coming weeks here, both for Power Platform tools and for D365 apps. Yeah, check that out. Various Microsoft MVPs who I've talked to in the past, Lisa Crosby, Diana Berkelbach, others are in here. So yeah, there's certainly a lot to absorb when it comes to features across Power Platform. All right. Well, should we wrap it up? I think we've covered a lot of ground here in the last 25 minutes or so.
We definitely have.
All right. Well, Eamon, thanks again for joining me. Anything else you want to call out that you have coming up?
Well, I'm hoping to do some more coverage, actually, of some of the changes going on with Power BI and Power Platform generally over the weeks to come. And our listeners should be on the lookout for some interesting new features. I'm working on one right now with a contributor on the subject of data classification. So that should be a very interesting one when that goes live.
All right, excellent. I'm also working on another podcast episode that's kind of top of mind, looking at evaluating Dynamics system integrators. So I should have some interesting insight on that from an interview I do with an analyst. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Eamon, thanks once again.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Jason.
And thanks to you for listening. You can reach me by email, jgumpert at msdynamicsworld.com. You can reach Eamon at earls@msdynamicsworld.com. You can also just follow us on Twitter or on LinkedIn for all of our updates, as we are putting out new content all the time. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.